So we've heard already today that periodic fire is very important for maintaining the structure and function of our oak-dominated ecosystems, and I'm going to present evidence from central hardwood forests, I think, basically supporting this idea. And I wanted to start out with a little bit of historical data because I am going to speak a lot about the role of historical fire and fire regimes. So this is a somewhat recent, at least within the past about 15 years study, essentially reconstructing fire history. And this is a county in southern Illinois, post-oak forest. And a lot of studies have already shown that in our region, around a 5-year fire frequency interval was fairly common. This study actually suggested that it was even more frequent. Fire was more frequent to maintain these stands. So they found in this particular case a 2-year fire return interval. So I think it really highlights, again, as we heard earlier today, the role of anthropogenic burning here happening to really reinforce or keep these oak forests resilient to change. And some of that was carried on even post-European settlement in these areas. But really it highlights the importance of this regular fire for maintaining these systems. And, this probably doesn't come as a big surprise to people in this audience that as we've suppressed or excluded fire from these systems, we've seen the decline in oak, and particularly in this advanced regeneration phase. So these are from our Illinois Forest Action Plan, and really highlighting that although we have oak on the landscape still, these are very mature oaks, and unfortunately we don't have the regeneration sort of, as it was mentioned earlier, sort of lying in wait, ready to replace these oaks when they die. So we're going to be in a very difficult situation here in the near term where we're not going to have oaks able to basically return to these landscapes. However, there's hope. So this is a figure from a paper published by Hutchinson et al. A couple of years ago, highlighting that with recurring prescribed fire, so one fire isn't enough, but many fires, there is the potential to reverse mesification and sustain oaks. So in the red, and it's overlapping with the purple, we see the treatments of fire and fire plus mechanical burning. And along the x-axis here, we have integrated moisture index. And I think what really shows on the y-axis here is the advanced regeneration of oak and hickory. And so this is a 20-year study where there was repeated burning. And what this really shows is, at least under dry conditions, fire, but also fire plus mechanical removal, can reverse these trends, right? So we can return oak to these landscapes. However, there's variation across the landscape. So as moisture increases, it may be more difficult to use fire and thinning together in order to have this reversal take place. So even with management, however, other things are changing in these landscapes. And that's really what I want to center my talk on today, is the role of these invasive grasses as well. So probably most people are familiar, and it was mentioned earlier, that there are invasive species that can alter fire behavior and fire regimes. And we've been hearing more and more about the grass fire cycle. So in temperate forests, this was originally conceived of in Western grassland systems, but in temperate forests, it has some similarities to the Western system, but also some differences. So we might have invasion taking place, so introduction of an invasive grass, as shown here, that can alter fuel characteristics. It can increase the load of fine fuels, for example, which perhaps are more flammable, and that can increase fire intensity. And with that increase in fire intensity, we can see a positive feedback to invasion, so more biomass of that invader, but we can also see a decline in native regeneration. One reason for that is, again, the increased heating effects and the damage or harm to especially small individuals. And of course, there's also the sort of direct invader effects on native regeneration through competition. So this fire cycle has the potential anyway to really stand in the way of our use of fire to manage these systems and potentially return them or restore them to our management goal of oak-dominated systems. So I'm going to talk about a lot of work that has been done in my lab on one particular invasive grass known as Microstygium biminium, or stilt grass, the common name I'll refer to it as. And this has been in our landscapes since about early 1900s, around 1915, 1920s, spreading from east to west. You can see it's fairly abundant in the southern part of Illinois. It's about halfway up the state of Indiana here, and some outlying populations elsewhere. And it's an interesting grass in the sense it's an annual grass. It's a C4 grass as well. Has a very shallow root system, and a lot of seeds are produced by this species, and it's annual. That makes a lot of sense, and already been documented as having a lot of negative effects on native communities. It can crowd out native plants. It can accelerate nitrogen cycling in a way that may contribute to invasional meltdown. It can also reduce soil carbon storage, which we just heard about. And then importantly, it has the potential to alter fire dynamics. So a couple things. One is previous work shows that burning following fire suppression, so for most of our forests that have not experienced fire for a long time, when you reintroduce fire, that can benefit stiltgrass performance. So evidence of this positive feedback between fire and invasion. So we've shown that, again, looking across the soil moisture gradient, that when you reintroduce fire, that there's a positive increase, or an increase in biomass, seed production, and overall recruitment. And that's, again, amplified by moisture. So it's a potentially very problematic species to have in an ecosystem. On top of that, it can alter the fuel loading in a given system. So this is work from a colleague who worked here in Indiana at Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge. And you can see the sort of blanket of fine fuels when you have a fairly severe invasion, and then not surprisingly, a very significant increase in maximum fire temperature and residence time because of that increase in the fuel load. So again, this potential for this fire feedback then to harm native seedlings that we may actually be trying to promote with fire. So further work showed that indeed we can have seedlings in particular being negatively impacted by fire when it's used in these stiltgrass invaded stands. So looking across a variety of different species, we found that invaded stands tended to have to suffer greater rates of mortality, essentially. So fewer survived and fewer resprouted in these invaded stands, presumably because of the heating effects. We didn't see that carry over to the larger size class individuals, so our saplings didn't have the same negative effects. So there's some reason for optimism there that if we can carry these individuals through to these larger size classes, they may not be affected in the same way. So that's all to say that when we reintroduce fire in these landscapes that have been, again, where fire's been suppressed or excluded for a long time, there may be some very adverse effects for, again, trying to maintain biodiversity, or especially promoting oak and hickory regeneration, if that's our goal. However, we also have found that these fire effects on stiltgrass performance depend strongly on fire frequency. So up until now, again, the examples I've shown you have been for these sites with fire exclusion or suppression. But when we worked in sites that had different fire histories, that is more frequent fire versus where fire has been excluded, we saw quite different effects on stiltgrass performance following reintroduction of fire. So we found that essentially in our sites that have experienced frequent fire, we see these changes in the abiotic conditions. We see increased surface soil temperature, decreased moisture, and a reduction as well in inorganic soil nitrogen availability. And interestingly, those are all associated then with a reduction in stiltgrass biomass. So we didn't really see any sort of effects of the experimental fires that we did so much as we saw really strong effects of the fire history, and that specifically the fire regime. So we wanted to explore this, there we go, explore this in depth to really understand what fire could do in a system in order to promote oak if that system is already invaded. We know, talking with managers in Southern Illinois, that this is a big issue for them. So we worked both on national forest land as well as on state properties where fire records had been maintained, and they've been doing some burning for about 30 years fairly regularly. So we were able to establish a nice gradient essentially of fire frequency using that historical fire data. And so we selected sites that varied in their fire frequency, had anywhere from 1 to 9 fires in about the past 30 years. And then we established pairs of plots. These are fairly small plots because we wanted to go in and then experimentally burn them. But we also wanted to make sure we had individuals there so we could look at the outcome of fire. So we planted white oak and black oak in each of those plots. And they were planted about a year before we actually then conducted those experimental burns. So those burns were conducted in March of 2024. And so again, some differences we had on our, again, across the full gradient, low fire frequency with fewer burns and longer fire-free periods. And then of course that contrasts on the other end with the higher fire frequency with many burns and shorter fire-free periods. So kind of trying to think through a little bit about the mechanisms, what could be driving differences along this gradient, and what would the implications be for oak. We first connected fire frequency to how that would affect abiotic characteristics, how that would affect fire intensity, and then the ramifications for stiltgrass itself. So we hypothesized essentially that increased fire frequency would, first of all, actually reduce fire intensity. And that's because as we have more fire in the landscape, we should be reducing the fuel loads, right? And end up with cooler fires. So we might then mitigate some of that damage that we would expect with invasion on oaks. So that's one reason why fire frequency could overall still be successful for promoting oak in these forests with invasion. Fire also, we know frequent fire can alter abiotic characteristics in important ways. We've heard already through musification what happens when we don't have fire, but so we know the opposite is true, that if we have a lot of fire, we're going to have warmer, drier microclimates. We're also probably going to have lower nitrogen availability because of the decrease in the turnover rates. And we're also going to have higher light availability. So all of those things together could basically be more conducive for survival and resprouting of oaks. And then we thought that that might, in the long run too, have a negative feedback to stiltgrass, which is a species that does generally prefer moisture conditions. But we weren't sure, and we weren't sure which of those would be a stronger magnitude effect. So I'm going to just jump into some of the results from this work. So first of all, we did find evidence that these abiotic characteristics varied in the ways that we expected with fire frequency, somewhat, right? So total burns, you can see they're going kind of an arrow towards the bottom. So that's an increase in total burns. And as those other variables are sort of correlated with that arrow, that means they're also increasing. So as more burning was taking place across this landscape, there's higher light availability and also warmer soils, right? So again, things that we would have expected as well. And then as kind of the opposite was happening, which is less burning, so longer fire-free periods, we had higher inorganic nitrogen availability and higher soil moisture. So we didn't really see evidence or strong evidence, at least, of that drying effect as much as we did the warming effect in the soils. So these are just evidence, again, that those abiotic conditions were changing across this fire history gradient with increasing fire frequency. We also found evidence that fire frequency was altering fire intensity. So again, on the x-axis here now, total burns, and on the y-axis, maximum fire temperature. And what you can see is there's a strong effect of just the amount of fire being experienced across these forests. So as more fire is happening on the landscape, essentially the temperature of these fires is decreasing, so they're cooler, lower intensity, and not a strong effect of stiltgrass. And if anything, in fact, this was a negative coefficient, suggesting that more stiltgrass in these systems was actually leading to cooler fires. Again, all these fires were happening during the dormant season in March over the span of a few days. So we didn't think that fire weather was really driving this. We think it's probably more to do with the fact that these plants are generally preferring these moisture areas in the first place. But we didn't see a necessarily strong effect of the fuel moisture conditions that we measured as well. But overall, evidence to suggest higher fire frequency is going to lead to these cooler fires, and the severely invaded plots are also showing experiencing cooler fires as well. All right, what does all this mean for oak? So I didn't show you this plot, but we also found that with more fire, light availability increased. So I showed you that in one of the first results plots mixed together with other covariates, but essentially that increase in light availability was also positively related to an increase in post-fire oak survival. So these are seedlings. I should mention they were 1 year old bare root seedlings that had been establishing for about a year before we burned them. But again, even when microstegium was present and very abundant, we didn't see any sort of negative effect of fire on survival. So that's really promising. Overall, more burning seemed to benefit oak regardless of whether stiltgrass was present and at any level of abundance. Okay, and we also measured about a year later the sort of resprout height and diameter, just to get a sense for the vigor of these resprouts that survived the fires. And again, we saw more fire was promoting the vigor of these resprouts again. So it's positive news in that respect. No effects of stiltgrass cover. And we also saw, a benefit of having more moisture in these ecosystems for that resprout vigor. So we wanted to then bring together all this information into sort of one model that helps us kind of understand the magnitude of these different effects. There's a lot of different moving parts in these systems. So we quantified these various pathways through something we call structural equation modeling, which again just tells us a little bit about the directionality of these effects as well as their magnitude. So the coefficients you'll see there are telling us the magnitude of the effect. So the higher the number, the stronger that effect. And the ones in black are positive effects, and you'll see some in red that are negative effects. So I'm going to build on this model. So just at the very basic level, we found that more burning, so more total fires, increased light availability, and that basically increased post-fire oak seedling survival. And there's also an effect of the initial height of those seedlings. So there was variation. We got these all from the state nursery. There was some variation which we measured so that the taller individuals did withstand fire better, and that's perhaps not surprising. But what else was going on besides just the role of light and these abiotic conditions changing? As I mentioned, we also saw a relationship with maximum fire temperature. So as we expected this, is there's more hotter fires, generally that's going to lead to more damage and perhaps higher mortality rates following fire for these oak seedlings. So that's why we see this negative effect. But upstream of that, you can see both this fire-free period as well as total burns were having an effect on that maximum fire temperature. So as we have longer fire-free periods, as we'd expect with fire exclusion, we're building up that organic horizon. So we're increasing our fuel load, and not surprisingly, we're increasing the maximum fire temperature in these systems. Total burns counteracts that in the sense of the more fires, we're able to reduce those loads over time. Right? And this was, we were mainly focused on measuring O horizon depth as our proxy for fuel accumulation. We know there's a lot of other fuels in these systems, and that's perhaps why we see this negative arrow between the total burns and the maximum fire temperature. Where does stilt grass cover come in here? We saw that there was, in fact, a negative effect of total burning on stilt grass cover. I'm not going to go into the mechanisms for that, but I have my graduate student, Kayla Morrison, is here, and she has a poster, so feel free to peruse that to understand a little bit more about how the demographic patterns of stilt grass populations are changing with more burning. And we did see that light, increasing the canopy openness, increasing light availability benefited stilt grass, but not to the extent that it had a negative effect on post-fire oak survival. And then interestingly, we saw that there was this negative relationship between stilt grass cover and maximum fire temperature. So again, to some extent, maybe not what we would have anticipated based on some of the earlier studies, but we think that this is, again, an indication that this particular invasive species at least has a preference for these moisture areas, and that in turn has this negative or dampening effect on fire intensity. Okay, so in conclusion, our evidence suggests that frequent fire can benefit oak regeneration even when stilt grass is present. And we think that's really mediated through this increase in light availability, the reduction in stilt grass cover, and especially in the drier sites, and also those shorter fire-free periods together with frequent fire, reducing fuel loads in a way that leads to these cooler fires and presumably less damage and mortality for those oaks. So, caveat here, obviously a lot of work has been done on this previously, this fire grass cycle. And so, I think there is still reason to be concerned when systems where we're reintroducing fire where there hasn't been fire for a very long time, that we may see harm to these oak seedlings in those types of systems. So proceeding with caution is important. So revisiting this grass fire cycle then in temperate forests, and it does appear that fire frequency is this sort of master controlling variable on a lot of these interactions because it can affect fuel characteristics, it can affect invasion dynamics, it can affect native regeneration all directly, and then these different factors, of course, interact with each other as well. And I just wanted to close with a couple parting thoughts, which is, we studied an invasive species that has a fairly unique life history, or it has a life history that makes it probably responsive to fire in a way that other species with different life histories may not respond. So I think it's important to just, again, make sure we're acknowledging that difference. That as a shallow-rooted species, it's probably particularly sensitive to these reductions in moisture at the microclimate scale, and these changes in nitrogen cycling as well. Under higher moisture conditions, I think we have evidence that suggests that these invasions are going to be more resistant to fire management. So I do think that, again, that's something important to take away from this. And then, in this particular case, we did find evidence that these seedling sizes are really important for understanding how they're going to respond to fire. Again, many in the audience, I'm sure already know this, so that the larger seedlings are going to be more likely to escape mortality from fire. And so really that sort of sets up this trade-off then between how often do we burn in order to promote oak, if we know a lot of burning is going to suppress these invasions, but we know too much burning could also cause mortality because we've had smaller individuals being exposed to fire. So I think thinking through that trade-off is important as well. All right, I want to end here with really acknowledging graduate students in my lab who've contributed to a lot of this work and thinking over the time. I've been working on this system, as well as a lot of different staff and both agency staff and extension staff who've helped us out working in Southern Illinois, where we've done this work, and our sponsors. So thank you.